at the right time. The last one is attrition on the customer side. This can happen on long delivery, on long transformation projects where the requirements gathering effort itself is so long. By the time requirements gathering sessions progress, there could be attritions happening on the customer side as well. People leaving and being replaced by somebody new. And as a result, there will be an erosion of knowledge, erosion of expectations. Expectations can change. And as a result, it can start exerting stress and strain on the vendor side in terms of revisiting and probably sometimes reworking what is already delivered. So these are some of the factors on the customer side which can induce a scope expansion. So as I said again, vendor has very limited scope for maneuvering over these limitations, but they can still achieve some level of stability when it comes to ensuring that the customers lack in understanding, lack in providing the right decisions in terms of requirements, etc. can be mitigated. The risk of such things happening is mitigated as much as possible. So let's look at vendor-induced scope expansion. There are 5 factors that play a role here in terms of skills and knowledge of the vendor, especially the business consultant, who are the key player when it comes to gathering the requirements and passing it on to the delivery team. So it is important for a vendor organization to ensure that the right people are placed for requirements gathering sessions. And communication, needless to say, communication is the most important, and it plays such a big role in ensuring that the scope is well understood, and it's not just about communicating with the customer, it's also about communicating with the backend team who are actually going to deliver the solution. So this communication on both sides, business consultants play a big role in ensuring that there is nothing falls through the crack. And it's not just about writing down the requirements so that everybody understands. It's also about non-verbal communications, verbal communication, presentation skills. All that is so important when it comes to ensuring that the requirements are captured properly. Software engineering tools. There are slides following this, so probably I will not spend too much time on explaining all this. Probably I will explain that in the subsequent slides. Software engineering tools like BPMN, UML, etc. Are important to use when it comes to complex requirements. Process maturity is about having the right process to capture the requirements, define the requirements, and trace the requirements all the way to delivery. Management, it's about customer management as well as the project management, ensuring that various stakeholders are managed properly to ensure that the scope does not expand uncontrollably. So skills and knowledge, revisiting that, whatever I explained again. So delivery teams lack of familiarity with the business domain. Many times what happens is that certain organizations, vendor organizations will be involved in different verticals. So when a vendor organization is going into a new vertical, which the first time the team is actually getting exposed to, many times I've seen teams struggling when it comes to understanding the requirement. It's again important to have domain experts in that particular domain who can actually provide consultative support for the delivery team as well as the requirements gathering team to ensure that the requirements are well understood. The second point is very important in terms of being myopic to implicit requirements. It often happens, especially when the customer is not in a position to articulate the requirements properly. A lot of unset requirements exist, which the team will come to know only towards the end of their delivery, and that will be too late to go back and fix, and it becomes very costly to do so. So if you are myopic to this, you are increasing the risk of scope expansion largely, and there is no easy way to achieve or address this particular issue. It comes with practice, it comes with experience in the domain. So an experienced business consultant or a business analyst would immediately know if the customer has not really given the full requirement. So it is important to probe the customer to get those implicit requirements, and if those requirements are not received in full, at least when it comes to providing your documentation of the requirements, it's important to add assumptions so that customer is aware that okay, there are certain things which are open, which are defined as assumptions, so that they can actually take it another look and then provide more clarity on those requirements. And the last one is about failure to see big picture of the requirements. It happens again on large transformation projects where there are multiple streams of workshops or requirements gathering sessions happening, and if people start working in silos, there is a big risk of people losing the big picture, and there can be inconsistencies and contradictions between requirements of various functionalities. Let me pause at this moment. Since the first time I'm doing, let me just see if anybody has asked any questions. Okay, there's a question. Will you be sharing the deck post the session is over? I'm more than happy to do so. I believe this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared as well, so it can be done. Okay, communication, one of the most important aspects when it comes to defining the requirements and delivering the solution. Inadequate communication skills, needless to say, as mentioned earlier, it's about verbal, non-verbal presentation, etc. skills, and it becomes that much more important when it comes to when the vendor and the customer do not have a common language that they are comfortable working with. So when you are working in different geographies, you often end up in a situation where, sometimes you may require an interpreter to understand what the customer is talking about, and that actually makes it that much more difficult to ensure that there's an effective communication that happens in the discussions. So again, there are a lot of things the vendor organization can do in terms of upskilling the people on right communication skills, employing the right people, maybe bringing an interpreter if required on situations where there is no common language existing. Inadequate communication practices. Now, this is about following the mature practices that is required to ensure that when a requirement is captured, it is traced all the way to the delivery and the testing and the customer testing, so that there is no room for any requirements or pieces of requirements falling through the cracks. It can easily happen if it is not tracked, and it's also about the communication practice is also about conveying the requirements to the design, development, and testing team. And again, business consultants play a big role in ensuring that the design and development and testing team understands the requirements well, so that the solution that is built is as per the requirement. Failure to provide assumptions, I mentioned that in the previous slide. It happens when there are implied requirements or requirements that are not clear or requirements that are not complete. In such cases, if there is a limit to what vendor organization can do in terms of persuading the customer to provide those requirements. Sometimes the customer may be busy with their ongoing operations, etc. They won't have time to do that. So at some point of time, like your deadlines is looming large, and you're always under pressure to meet those deadlines. So at that point of time, you have no choice but provide assumptions and go on. And then when you deliver your document to the customer saying, okay, these are my requirements, these are my assumptions, at that time it is very obvious for the customer saying that, oh, okay, the vendor has not really understood all the requirements, so let me spend some more time to clarify those. Software engineering tools. So it's not just about talking to the customer and writing down the requirements. It's also about using some of the tools which are available in the market in terms of some of the things like BPMN is more of a BPMN and UML are some of the notations and languages used especially for defining requirements which are complex, which requires a lot of decision points, where a lot of workflow is involved, etc. It becomes that much easier when you're discussing this with the customer with the help of such tools. Especially like when there is no common language that both the parties are comfortable with, the tools come in handy to ensure that it is captured well. Process maturity, I touched upon that in the previous slide in terms of tracking the requirements right from the stage of capture and all the way to the delivery. And in each point, if there is no proper gating done to ensure that, for instance, just to give an example, you have captured a whole lot of requirements, and how do you ensure that those requirements are captured in your design documents or in your software? So in each stage in the project lifecycle, it is important that the vendor does a proper gating of the deliverable at that point of time, and then the requirements are tracked in each of those stages so that nothing is missed in the delivery process. Management is about there are a couple of things that is important here. One is, of course, the customer management. Some customers many of the customers can be very difficult when it comes to everybody is working under a lot of budget constraints, time constraints, etc. So many times it becomes very difficult to get to make the customer understand that, okay, there's a change in the scope and it's going to have an impact on the delivery in terms of the time, in terms of the cost, and in many cases it can actually impact the quality as well. So how do you steer the customer in the right direction, making the customer understand the risk of making any changes, etc. is very important. And customer management, the ability of the customer management team to make this happen plays a big role in ensuring that the scope is stable and the delivery happens on time, on budget, and on quality. And change management is again related to the previous one in terms of customers, because of the change in ecosystem, the changes, if it is not managed properly, it can impact in terms of the delivery never really happening in time, and the cost overrun, etc. happens if the change is not managed properly. And again, a customer management team has to ensure that the customers are made aware of the impact this is causing to the team and how the changes will manage. In some cases, in many cases for that matter, a change is inevitable because if the customer's business is changing, you cannot say that, okay, my project is in progress, you cannot go and change. It may be a very highly business critical change that the customer wants to do. But then how nimble is the vendor organization to ensure that those changes are incorporated without really impacting the time and cost and the quality is very crucial. Gold plating, creeping elegance, I already talked about it. I'm not going to repeat that again. Attrition, again, software software industry, the attrition is pretty high, and it happens especially in a long delivery cycle. It is possible that the team loses key resources on the way, and as a result, the there are a lot of like requirements or the knowledge or the skill that is um, not very easy to like you uh, fill the gaps left behind by attrition. And many times, there is a lot of uh, requirements, or not the requirements as such, but it's about the knowledge or certain, for instance, certain decisions that are taken at that some point of time in the initial stage of the project. And if that is not properly documented or captured, the philosophy behind a certain way of requirements being captured or the design being done, um, if the key person leaves and if these are not documented, it becomes very difficult for the team who are left behind to understand and um, take care of it. So when the organization has a it's important that the attrition is um, the impact due to attrition is handled properly, so that the ongoing delivery is not impacted. I am coming towards the end of my slide deck. A couple of more slides remaining. Um, so this particular slide, I try to sum up in terms of the maturity versus the risk of expansion. So when I talk about maturity here, I'm talking about the maturity in terms of the communication, the process maturity, the knowledge and the skills in the domain, etc. Collectively, this maturity on both the vendor side as well as the customer side, I thought I will just depict that in one slide in terms of how it impacts the risk. So on the bottom left quadrant, the risk is of course high when the maturity of both the stakeholders are very low, as compared to on the top right hand corner, that quadrant, the risk is obviously very low when both are matured, highly matured. When it comes to vendor maturity, if the vendor maturity is low, I've kept it as low or moderate on the top left-hand quadrant, mainly because from a vendor standpoint, since I'm hosting from a vendor standpoint, I thought vendor has more liberty in terms of what actions they can take to mitigate those risks, whereas vendor has very limited influence over what customers, how customers' maturity can be addressed. So that's why on the bottom right-hand corner, that quadrant is moderate high. So in conclusion, we talked about a few things. Scope, needless to say, is the bedrock of a solution. It is a foundation on which your solution is built. And if the foundation is not stable, and if it is continuously changing, the structure is going to be weak, obviously. And as a vendor delivery team, it becomes very important to ensure that the foundation is strong, the bedrock is strong, so that the structure that is built on top is strong enough and it is enduring. And organizations must invest in reducing or eliminating the barriers that we talked about. It might be costly upfront, but in the long run, there will be definitely a lot of returns from this investment that organizations can make to have that solid foundation for any solution. So that concludes my presentation. As I mentioned earlier, this presentation, the content of this presentation is based on my article. I have given the links. I'll just type that link on the chat window here so that you can click on it. And I also can be reached on LinkedIn. There is only one Suresh Randadath in LinkedIn, thanks to my very unique last name. So you can easily find me if you would like to share any offline thoughts questions, I'm more than happy to engage in those discussions. So at this point, I will stop and I will open up the floor for any questions, and I will attempt to answer those questions. If I am not able to answer, I will definitely come back to you either through, I hope, IMB Alumni Association has a platform where I can interact with you again. Thank you. Okay, so Vijay is asking if there is a checklist you would like to share for handling effective software requirement management. I do not have a checklist offhand, but definitely I can suggest some guidelines that you can follow in terms of how you approach a requirements workshop. What are the things that you need to do in terms of homework, and typically people use for a given domain. For instance, I'm pretty much focused on the telecom side of business. So there can be some templates which people normally use, which contains a lot of questions surrounding that particular domain. And many times the requirements workshop are driven using this template, so that the discussions becomes much more structured, and there is no room for something being missed out, etc. So that is normally used by delivery teams. So I don't know whether you want to call it as a checklist, but yeah, which I can actually share something offline. Okay, Sriram is asking, have you seen differences in the way requirements are produced in teams following waterfall versus agile methodology? Good question, Sriram. I am a new entrant into the agile way of delivery, and I must admit that I am caught between these two methodologies at this moment. I had written a separate article. I'm happy to share. You can actually see it in my LinkedIn page. It's about uh, the issues that you normally find in the waterfall way of delivery. And to answer your question, I don't think there should be any difference in terms of how the requirements should be captured. Uh, in the agile way of doing things, agile being agile, you don't really like no get into a long requirements workshop sessions and long delivery cycles. So things happen in shorter durations. Uh, at the there are pros and cons in terms of this approach. I would say the pros is basically in terms of you are you are basically asking questions to customers like, okay, what is important for your business? What do you require on day one? So that way, you're not overwhelmed by too much of requirements, too much of information in the discussions, and the customer also very focused in terms of what they really want on day one or day two, etc. So that way, it becomes easy to engage the customer and being a part of a very focused discussion. And whereas the pitfall of agile, what I've seen in my short experience in the agile side, is that the failure to see a big picture, because we are all so focused on addressing that particular immediate requirement. You're not really looking at the long-term view of the requirement. You're not looking at the requirements across enterprise, or you're not really looking at the any contradictions that may happen between other functional areas, etc. So those are the cons, especially in agile. Whereas, when you look at waterfall, typically the cycles are pretty long, and I mentioned in my previous slides that ensuring the durability of the requirement, enduring requirements, it becomes very difficult, because as the life cycle increases, the requirements tend to become obsolete very fast, and so you end up doing a lot of changes on the way. So that way agile is much more easy to handle, but again, both has their own advantages and disadvantages. And but yeah, to answer your question, uh, uh, the requirements are more focused in agile compared to waterfall, where the requirements are kind of all encompassing kind of thing. Ganesh is asking, I would also be interested on the template that useful for a structured discussion, which you mentioned to share offline. Kindly do send it to me on. Sorry, Ganesh, unfortunately, I will not be able to share the template. That is the proprietary template my company uses. But what I can do is I can help you in terms of providing some guidelines on how you can approach, because um, uh, because it's not just about template is one thing, which is no specific to a given domain. There are a lot of other things you need to do in terms of uh, uh, no how you can prepare yourself um, for a requirements gathering engagement with the customer. I hope I am able to answer your questions. If I'm still not very clear to you, please feel free to highlight. Um, um, I'm more than happy to clarify any further questions. Okay, Arnab is asking me, what would be your suggestion in terms of prioritizing new budget and time? What will you consider first? Good question, Arnab. So um, in terms of prioritization, typically what happens is uh, we do what is known as a critical success factor study, in which there are tons of requirements. Customer wants so many things, and it's important to understand what is those 20% of the requirements that's going to give 80% of the benefit to the customer. Especially that is important for agile way of delivery. It's important to have those important requirements addressed. So when it comes to prioritizing, um, I would suggest that we look at what is important for the customer, especially it's important, especially if you are acquiring a new logo or you're getting into first time engagement with the customer. It's important that the customer appreciates the solution that we deliver, and if that solution is not going to really not adding value to his business, customer is not going to really appreciate, or the customer may not engage with you in the long run. So I would suggest that we focus all our energy and the budget available in ensuring that those high priority business critical requirements are addressed, um, and uh, and then that is the kind of prioritization I would do. At the same time, when you do that, you should also be mindful of your organization's own preparedness as well as the capability in meeting those. So you need to strike a balance in terms of what you can do. Like for instance, in some cases you may not have the resources available with you to provide those solutions, even though it is business critical to the customer. So if there is a lead time required for onboarding the resources, or having any other resources for that matter, it's not just about manpower resources, any other resources that is required. So you need to, if you are not ready to meet those customers' high priority requirements, you need to engage with the customer and reach strike a balance in terms of given the constraints, how you can prioritize in terms of meeting the customer's business critical needs as well as your own limitations in terms of what you can achieve. So to answer your question further, I would consider customers' business criticality first. That's more important for me as a vendor, and then I look at what I'm capable of, and then ensuring that I can provide those solutions considering the constraints that I may have. Kapil is asking, how often do you have change control board? Now, change control board should be in place as soon as possible. I would say that when change is basically on something that is already approved by the customer. So if something is not approved by the customer, it is not being changed. It is not being change managed. So change control board has to be placed as soon as things are approved by the customer. So things like your system requirement specification, which we typically use in defining a requirement, once that is approved, typically those are one of the first few collaterals that get approved by the customer. As soon as that is approved, the change control board should be in place so that any changes that happens on that needs to be managed carefully to ensure that the impact is assessed and it is communicated to the customer and it is driven in the right direction. So Kapil, to answer the question further, the change control board has to, once it is formed, it has to be existing throughout the life cycle of the delivery till the solution is accepted by the customer. Arnab is asking one more query: when an upcoming requirement is a big treat to existing already developed. When upcoming requirement is a big treat to existing already developed architecture. Sorry, Arnab, could you please clarify that question one more time? or threat. Okay, that threat to existing already developed. So let me try to understand your question. You're saying there is an architecture which is already developed, and there is a requirement that is coming new, which is going to have a profound impact on the architecture that is already developed, right? So your question is in terms of how you will address this. Okay, I presume the answer is yes. So um, uh, it is it is always very difficult to change something that is already in place. Um, um, but again, like no, there are certain changes which cannot be delayed, which cannot be deferred, uh, because for the customer that is so important for their business. And if the vendor goes back to the customer saying that no, I already developed the solution, you cannot change, it is not going to go down well with the customer. So it is important to sit across the table, discuss with the customer, explain to him, okay, this is the architecture, and you are saying that okay, this has to be changed, and so you have to explain what is the impact on the change in terms of it can even risk their business. It's not just about risking the vendors delivery cost and time. It's also might risk the vendors, customers' business. So this is where the consultancy skills of the vendor comes into play, the customer management skills of the vendor comes into play in terms of uh, driving the discussion in the right direction. And if if it if the situation is such that it is no matter how risky it is, it has to be changed, then we have to go back to the drawing board and then revisit the architecture and then come up with a new estimate saying that okay, yes, see, uh, see, ultimately, what is written down, what is agreed upon, what is approved commercially plays so important role, because if those things are not properly defined and if there are room for debates, etc., it becomes very difficult for both the parties to come to an agreement. If things are properly captured upfront in every collateral, every stage of the life cycle, it becomes that much easy to convince the customer saying that okay, this is a departure from the originally agreed scope and the solution, and as a result, it's going to take this much amount of effort uh, and time to make that change to the architecture. And it's not just about commercial aspects; it's also about technological viability of the architecture. Sometimes if the customer is asking for something which is going to break the architecture completely, then those should be highlighted as well. Okay, it looks like there are no more questions. If you still want to, okay, um, Arnab has one more question. Your suggestion to handle changes in fixed cost project. Okay, uh, yeah. So if the project is a fixed cost project, it becomes um, very difficult. It's going to be very risky for the vendor because it's going to have a commercial impact to the vendor for sure. Um, there is no easy answer. The answer is basically to ensure that you have all uh, your deliverables well defined, so that there is no room for interpretation or there is no room for debate. Um, and if that is taken care of, it becomes easy to convince the customer saying that, okay, this is an additional change and this cannot be accommodated in the originally agreed cost, because that fixed cost was identified based on a certain scope that was defined at the sales stage. And if that was defined properly, and then it becomes easy to convince the customer. But if we make any mistake at that stage where like no the expectation in terms of the scope is not well defined, um, many times it becomes very difficult to convince the customer, and it's possible that the vendor will be forced to accommodate that change at the expense of cost overruns. And so my suggestion is to ensure that the scope is well defined and well contained, and it is communicated well with the customer, and so that it becomes easy to manage this, especially in fixed cost project. It's a very good question. So Arnab, just to add to what I mentioned. So in such situations, if you're able to convince the customer, then it has to be put through a change management process, and it becomes an additional scope, and it has to be separately negotiated commercially, and it will be outside of the fixed cost project. So that way, like you're commercially covered on handling those changes. And this is why the change control board is so important, um, to ensure that this is handled. And feel free to ask me questions. That actually it helped me as well, because these questions are important. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll wait for a couple of more minutes, and if there are more questions, I am more than happy to answer those. Otherwise, we can close this webinar. Okay, looks like there are no further questions. Thank you once again for your patient listening, and it was great to deliver this session. Thank you once again, IMB Alumni Association, for giving me this opportunity to deliver this webinar. Thank you. Have a good day. Yes, Arnab, this will be available in the IMB Alumni Association portal. That's a link to the webinar section of the portal, and the archive of the past sessions can be seen there.